Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maura Keefe. I'm one of the scholars in residence here, and I am delighted to be moderating this Pillow Talk today called Dance We Must, Another Look. First, a little business. These talks happen Friday and Saturday and are part of the free event series, which also includes the Inside Out performances Wednesday through Saturday. As you might suspect, tonight's Inside Out with the participants in the TAP program has been called for Inside. Tickets will become available for the free event at 5 o'clock, so I am keeping us on the clock so you can do everything. It's also Pillow Pride Weekend, which celebrates our long legacy as being a welcoming place to people of all kinds of identities. That includes a fabulous party after the performances tonight under the big tent on the Great Lawn, a historic tour tomorrow, and many other things that you can find by looking on the Pillow website or at posters around campus. Now on to today. Dance We Must, Another Look. We take the title from the exhibition that surrounds us. Some of the things that this exhibition encourages us to think about is certainly a variety of dance forms and cultures, as well as theatricality, race, nation state, identity, and cultural appropriation. And if that doesn't seem like something we can cover in an hour, you need to meet our guest for today. Sitting right next to me is Paul Scolieri, chair and professor of dance at Barnard College. He's the author of Dancing the New World, Aztecs, Spaniards, and the Choreography of Conquest. And more importantly for today, his new book is called Ted Shawn, His Life, Writings, and Dances. Comes out in October from Oxford University Press. Next to him is choreographer and dancer Lionel Popkin. He is on the dance faculty at the Department of World Arts and Cultures at UCLA, where his colleague is Kyle Abraham. He danced with Trisha Brown, Terry Creech, and Stephanie Scora. As a choreographer, he's made a series of works that deal with cross-cultural conversations between his postmodern dance training and the imagery and iconography of the Indian subcontinent. Of particular interest to us today is his work that was inspired by the career of modern dance pioneer Ruth St. Denis. Ruth doesn't live here anymore. Norton Owen has been associated with the Pillow since 1976. He oversees all programs concerning dance documentation, exhibitions, archival resources, while also coordinating the work we're doing today. Longtime director of the Lamone Institute, chair of the Dance Heritage Coalition, and resident curator at the National Museum of Dance are some of the other things he's done. He is currently the president of the O'Donnell Green Music and Dance Foundation. And starting a new page is Patsy Gay. She's the associate archivist here at the Pillow, and prior to coming to the Pillow in this capacity, because she is a successful alum of the internship program as well, she was the archivist and associate producer for Dave Gordon's Pickup Performance Company. She also worked alongside as a technical fellow, preservation technical fellow with the Dance Heritage Coalition, working on archives for Dance Theater of Harlem, Aiko and Coma, and Laura Lubavitch. So thank you all so much for joining me in this conversation. As you might suspect, the exhibition centers on Ted Shawn, Pillow founder, and Ruth St. Denis, so they need a brief bio. He was a pioneering figure of modern dance, champion of the male dancer and founder of Jacob's Pillow. She, another pioneer, she built a stunning career as a soloist, and then in 1914 acquired a professional and personal partner in Shawn. In 1915, they opened Denishawn, which was a school and a company. It nurtured a generation of modern dancers, including Martha Graham, Doris Humphrey, and Charles Weidman. So Paul, first question for you. The first part of this talk is titled Dance We Must. Then we're going to say what another look means. But Dance We Must, Paul, tell us what that comes from.
Sure. Dance We Must is actually the title of one of Shawn's books. He was once called the writingest of dancers. He actually published over 9 books and pamphlets in his lifetime. Dance We Must is a compilation of his lectures that he gave to a graduate school, the Peabody Institute in Nashville, Tennessee. So it was published in 1940 for the first time. So it was a collection of his major ideas around teaching and what he believed every dance teacher ought to know about dance to convey to their students.
Okay, and Norton, what about this another look part?
Well, of course, this exhibit is built upon the exhibit that happened last year at Williams College Museum of Art. So this came about through wanting to show all of the materials from the Pillows collection that we don't usually get to see. WICMA came along with an offer we couldn't refuse of being able to show so much of our treasures there. So the title of the show there was Dance We Must. But in bringing it to the Pillow, we thought about, well, we're not just showing that same exhibit. It's actually reconfigured in a lot of ways. It's smaller, for one thing, but it's also, we've added a lot of context to it. And what we wanted really for people to do was to literally have another look. So it's another look, another chance to see it for the people who went to WICMA last summer. For the people who didn't make it there, it's another chance to see it, but we didn't call it Dance We Must, Another Chance. But we really did also want to, what Patsy and I worked really hard to do was to show some of the things that were there, but put it, obviously since it's coming home to our midst, we had an opportunity to look at it in a different way, and I think we've done that.
So Patsy, I want to ask you, because when you were here as an intern, you certainly knew there were trunks down in the basement, like the one that's sitting over there. And as the collection was being assembled for Williams College last summer, you saw a lot of stuff, but perhaps less familiar with the collection than Norton, who sort of lived with it for a few more decades than you. So I'm wondering if as Kevin Murphy and Caroline Hamilton, who were the co-curators for the WICMA exhibit, as they were finding things, if there were things that you thought, oh my God, I never thought about that, or that you were seeing things that now that you've had a chance to curate this exhibition with Norton, that you were thrilled to be able to sort of talk about those.
Yeah, definitely. We were really lucky to work quite closely with Kevin Murphy and with Caroline Hamilton in the process of gathering the materials. They were the curators, but we were the ones who were providing it, showing them what possibilities might be. But then, through their eyes, we really got a chance to see some of these materials in a new way. Kevin Murphy brought a really interesting perspective of being an art historian. He is a curator of American art, and so he was really interested in who were the photographers, who were the painters, whereas I was really interested in, what is the dance, what, like that to me is what is important about a photograph, but for him there's a whole other context of understanding, where were these images being taken, who was seeing these, which was really exciting. And Caroline Hamilton brought a whole other understanding by looking at the materiality of the physical costumes themselves. So I look at a costume as being representative of a dance, where she looked at a costume as having a whole history in and unto itself. And so she was really able to dig into that in a way that I had never seen before in my experience of being sort of a more traditional type of archivist, which was really exciting.
So before we talk about the exhibition any further, I want to just talk for a minute about the kind of different purposes that archives have served for each of you in your various endeavors as researchers. So I think, Paul, I want to start with you, because you've written a biography of Ted Shawn, which means you have spent a few days, weeks, months, years going through boxes of stuff. So could you say something about maybe even just thinking about the archives here specifically, going into the archives for the first time, like what were your expectations and hopes of what you might discover?
Oh, well, actually the first time, it was over 12 years ago here, that I even thought of doing a project on Ted Shawn, was I was here because I was interested that Ted Shawn had created a dance based on the conquest of Mexico, which was the subject of my research before this book. So I was just interested in this dance and why Ted Shawn would be choreographing a dance based on this really important Mexican event and this book. And Norton tapped me on the shoulder and said, you might want to see this. And everything changed. And so I just saw the Wendy Whelan piece the day, and there are moments of defining moments in your life. So I could say the day Norton tapped me on the shoulder in the archive. And that was basically a scenario for a dance that Shawn never produced. But it was really his vision of dance in America. It was a sort of he wrote it at a time where he was really fomenting his idea of what American dance could be. And it's a troubling dance, and it's a troubling scenario in some ways we might talk about. It was really informed by eugenics and imagery from the eugenics movement, But it was never produced, which was actually a very good sign. But in fact, it's really what opened up for me a way of looking at the archives, saying, how do we actually trace the story of race and gender and sexuality through dance, through someone who is at the center of thinking through the body and these identities. Ted Shawn was born in a time when the term modern dance, male dancer, and homosexuality were not known to Americans. And his life really became a way of thinking about the coalescence between these three categories. So that was one moment.
So I'd say you didn't have those expectations going into it. It was sort of like a step and then another discovery and another discovery that
That's
has
right.
taken you this decade of thinking about it to realize, now the book is done, you can say these
That's
things
right.
are coming together.
Right. No one perfected the story of Ted Shawn better than Ted Shawn. So we lived with this story. And part of the thing that has been amazing has been all of, I think, the thinking, the connections he had between Kenzie and Alfred Kenzie, the sex study guy, right? And Havelock Ellis, and major scientists and writers and thinkers that were all behind the scenes and really helping him inform his idea of what dance could be. So this was never part of the story that he told, but it's a part of the story that he meticulously left behind and documented in various archives. So in a way, I'm taking his cue. In fact, one of my favorite things in the archive at the New York Public Library Dance Division is his unedited manuscript, which only covers a portion of his life. It's 650,000 words. And in it, at the end of it, he writes to future scholars. This is the order of books that you should write about me. And he lists the topics. And it's extremely, on the one hand, it's extremely useful because it's a great way to understand how he understood his life. But I think he had the full expectation that with giving over his life's archives, and he had archives from the very beginnings of his life. I mean, this was someone with a goal because he maintained programs and clippings, right, in a way that he had a sense of what the totality of his life would amount to. And so I love that he also gave us those clues about how to write his life. But now, 50 years and beyond after his death, I think, he left a legacy, we are here in it, that I don't think he fully even imagined.
So Lionel, I want to bring you into the conversation here because Paul went in with some notion of kind of the complexity of like, what the hell was Shawn doing making this dance about a Mexican moment of history and discovering some surprises and some admiration and some consternation, I would say, about some of the things about Shawn. But going into the archives of Ruth St. Denis and some of the collections that you looked at, I mean, you had a different goal. You weren't writing a book, you were making a dance. But could you tell me a little bit just about like what was your attitude about Ruth St. Denis?
Starting off, what was my attitude about Ruth St. Denis? Well, let me just talk a little bit about what I see as a role of an archive, and then get to that. Part of my physical lineage is postmodern dance, where it's often like throw out the old, what's new, right? And then another part of my lineage is very much a historical way of looking. What is the legacy? What have we inherited? What are the things that bring us forward? Who are our elders? And so those two are seemingly kind of incompatible with each other to a certain extent. And so I think for me, I was actively looking for some way to wrestle with those two complexities. And Ruth St. Denis seemed to me to be a person who brought together those two things in a sense that she engendered this form that we call modern dance. She's one of the grandmothers, right? And with Ted, trained Martha and Charles and Doris, et cetera, and on and on and on. And through, that lineage goes through Trisha, who I danced for. And then at the same time, her initial public offering in 1906 is this suite of Indian dances. And my mother's from India, that's the connectivity. And when I was in college, I lived in Delhi for a while studying Indian dance. So the kind of coalescence of this kind of portrayal from an outside of India standpoint of what Indian dance could be, and then this legacy of modern dance that actually started from that moment of Orientalism, she suddenly became an incredible flashpoint figure. Now, going in, I didn't like her very much. Let's just be really clear. right? Like, I was like, there's a lot of history of colonialism, of racism, of privilege, of all these things going on that are really difficult to stomach for someone like me from my perspective, and quite painful.
Wait, can I just, so someone like you, because both that you had studied Indian dance in a way that St. Denis didn't, coming from you also with an Indian heritage, like, so why particularly painful for you?
Those two things, but also the right to portray your own image and what that means, and to say it in a way that you believe is what your image is, as opposed to what you think other people think that image should be. Right, so that's a very complex set of power dynamics about what is presented, by whom, when, and how are those things met and seen. I hate the word aesthetics, but aesthetically, in terms of how that went. But one of the things that happened while I was researching is I was like, damn. I mean, I looked at how I toured with Trisha, and that's like a great company, you tour a ton, right? And then I look at their touring, and you're like, oh my God, they worked. Right? Like, there's a whole thing happening. And then you also think about 2006, she starts off solo. And for roughly 8 years before she meets Ted, she's doing this solo career as a woman in 1906 to 1914. That's a whole story that I can't embody and I can't know, but is damn impressive. And so there was a push and pull between being both kind of a little confused by the imagery and then also a little kind of impressed by what she did with it. And the other thing that's intriguing to me about this is, so sometimes when we talk about the history of modern dance, we start with Martha, right, and Lamentation, or these kind of austere emotional. If you look at Martha's first works, they're very much Denishawn Orientalism skirts. If you go to Rochester, New York, you can see them in the Eastman Kodak Museum. I forget the exact name of the museum, but so she started out coming from Denishawn, recreating what she had been performing. And so we kind of allied that because somewhere we kind of think, ooh, that stuff is a little weird. I think Norton writes up there something about it looking a little comic booky, right? And so there is something in us that feels just a little queasy about it, and yet at the same time, there's a impressiveness about it that is very confusing. And I, as someone of hybrid nature who grew up in very, a confusing arena, I find those confusions fascinating. I find the idea that that identity can't be defined singularly, but must be approached with multiplicity, really interesting. And those difficult conversations, I think, are what take us farther. Yeah.
So Patsy, I want to ask you, because I've been thinking about your work, pre-Pillow history, working with David Gordon on his archivography project, and seeing a performance of his archives. He was kind of reinventing the present and the past simultaneously. And so I'm wondering if you could, with your archivist hat on, just say something about sort of the stability of archives and whether the truth is in there.
Oh yeah, definitely. So I think that one of the things that was most eye-opening to me working with an actual artist in the archives, you're not working with somebody's papers after they passed away or after they stopped, somebody who's actually, you're reading that story, but they're also telling you that story, was understanding that the truth that as a Western society we often put into the written word is a lot more flexible than we actually really think it is. One of the things that was most surprising to me as I was first working with David Gordon's materials, I came in to do an inventory of his collection so it could be donated to New York Public Library for Performing Arts. Pretty straightforward, right? I was looking at a videotape, I was writing down what it was, figuring out which one is the earliest one and which one is the 17th copy that they made to send off to somebody, like, easy, right? And so I was trying to figure out, okay, which was the authentic version of his dances, right? So I was like, okay, David, you performed this work here, you performed it there, you performed it here, and then you sort of changed it a little bit and performed it there under a slightly different name, and then you took a part of it and performed it 20 years later, but which one's the real dance? And he's just like, that's not how it works. Like there is no true understanding of what a dance piece is, and when you document that in the archives, you're adding all these layers of truth that comes by having it in a library, having an archivist show it to you, having it be an old paper that you feel there's a reverentialness about it, that it's somebody's handwritten words, so that must have a layer of truth. And it just helped me understand how totally complex it is, and then especially when you take all of this messiness and try to shove it into a library, we're like, we have to put this in a catalog, right? We have to be able to write this down in a way that somebody can understand it and find it, and that there's all these frictions in there. And I was finding this out because I was able to talk to the actual artists themselves. And so then coming here, working with the collections of Ted Shawn and Ruth St, artists who are no longer with us, to be able to speak about their own truth, helps me try to find the complexity within those written records that we have, and try to understand that, Shawn, St. Denis were great marketers, and so what they were saying on that paper is a truth, but it's probably not the whole truth. What was the truth of the people who were seeing that work? What is the truth of the people who were dancing that work? What is the truth when she first made it versus the truth when she, we're still performing it decades later? There's a lot of complexity in that isn't always understood when you're coming into an archive.
Norton, I want to ask you about this because one of the things that you write in your bio for the Pillow website is that it says Norton seeks to make the Pillow's archival holdings widely available. And this is all sort of the prehistory of the exhibition. I think, why is that important to you as the director of preservation here? Because there are certainly plenty of archivists who don't want you to touch anything.
Yeah, well, I think that the key thing for me is that the Pillow's uniqueness is really built on, 50% I would say of what it's built on is its history. It's of course got a very powerful present, and we all wouldn't be sitting here today if there weren't performances going on and a school happening, etc. All that's fantastic, but what has happened here up until now is at least as important in terms of making what we do here transcendent, let us say. So if that is true, if that's a given, some people may argue with me, but I'll argue back. So if we accept that as a given, then it seems to me that part of the responsibility, certainly in my role, is how do we make that visible to people? Because the present is really visible. It's right here, going to a performance. You can see it, it's right there. But if somebody comes to the Pillow and they haven't read up on their dance history, or they don't have a history here, a tradition of coming here, how are they going to tap into what makes the place special? We have to find ways to put it in front of them. So I think that's really why we want to always look at ways that we can continue to recontextualize our past, so that people can, as they come to see something in the here and now, that they also are hit at with the same force by what has happened up to now, and then that magic happens. So, and I think in particular, what with this exhibition we were able to do, which is really an incredible gift for us to be able to work in this way, to look at items here that are 100 years old or more, and not just be interested in them because they're old, but actually be interested in them because of what they say about today's world, and about how we think about other cultures, and about how certain imagery might be problematic or challenging for people. Those are things that we can look at now as being really relevant, and that we can do so while also considering it as part of our history is just enormously valuable.
Well, one of the things I was thinking, because we were talking earlier this week about how there's kind of like this is all the Billy stuff. But then some people from an esteemed museum down the road said, we love this stuff and it has value. And so I'm wondering for both of you if there's something about the familiar became unfamiliar because somebody else curated it, and if it helped you in thinking about what you wanted to have in the collection, that you were seeing it also through the eyes of the exhibition at Wickman.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'll say for one thing, it is both wonderful and a little hilarious that things that come out of our basement here then suddenly are hung on a museum wall, and you think, and then they take them off the museum wall and they go back into our basement. But
our climate controlled archival basement.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Yes. But the truth is that all of these things have had a very, multi-layered background, and the costumes that we now can see in all their glory did spend decades packed away in trunks in spaces that were not climate controlled, and so we really have been able to see those things go from being excess costume materials that maybe might get used in another show, like, real practical items, to then becoming sort of like, what are we going to do with all this stuff? Then to becoming museum objects, and then coming back here where they have that extra patina. Everything that you're seeing in here has hung on the walls of museums and has been through that certain, lens. So.
Go ahead.
I do want to say one thing to add about the archives. Shawn was archiving and saving his material, one, because he was profoundly nostalgic, right? So there was that was part of his personality. But also, he understood how to build and use institutions. And when he started to collect and ferment and bring together his archive, he first gave it to the Museum of Modern Art, because he understood that the power of dance, and to give it the stature it needed and the credibility it needed in the larger art world, it needed to be attached to an institution that was forming and building. So it was a very, I think, artistic reason and personal reason that he collected, but he also understood that there was power in aligning himself with institutions that wanted to document this. And in fact, one of the first exhibits that MoMA had a dance division, and he was part of that first exhibit. And so that was very important, because it came at a time after Denishawn where he thought all of his work and the work of Denishawn and the legacy of early modern dance might entirely disappear. And he was not wrong about that. And it was in part by his savvy and understanding that they needed institutional memory, archives to make that project legible and memorable. So that was part of his, I think, an enormously important facet about how he kept and why he kept archives.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I was thinking about, that certainly when they were still touring and Denishawn, I mean, they were incredible celebrities, and they had a kind of star power, and then when Shawn moves up here, there were letters to the precursor of Dance Magazine saying they needed to make a statement about their marriage, and so they really were kind of an object of great fascination in their moment. But I was wondering if you guys would say something about why you think, I mean, certainly what you just said about Shawn being savvy about the kind of longevity, but why do you think they resonate today? Say Denis and Shawn.
Resonate might not be the verb.
Okay, pick a new one.
They become a confluence of a lot of question marks, of what kind of dance we're seeing, where we're seeing it, who is being portrayed, who's in charge of that, who's commenting on it. I think the institution building is certainly part of it for Ted, but he was much more savvy than Ruth. Ruth always had to have somebody else doing things for her in order to make it work out. But I think part of it is this place. Like the site here, that it is still a living, breathing festival with performances that keep coming through, is very different from, say, Ruth's last studio, which is at 3433 Cahuenga Boulevard. And if you go to Universal Studios in Hollywood, it's right across the street, right? But you wouldn't know it, right? So there was that sense that people are still seeing dance here and very much in a vibrancy that keeps us coming back to them, as well as, looking at other cultures has kind of makes its way. Every 20 years there's a different, cross-culturalism, interculturalism, new interculturalism. And as people are able to communicate differently, and as people are able, with visas and actual immigration laws, change who can be where, different possibilities open up. And I think that's a really important kind of shift. It's important to think that when Denishawn was at its height, the Asian Exclusion Act was in full swing. So those bodies weren't allowed to be here performing, right? I mean, some were allowed in, there were the occasional exceptions, but that runs it through, and then in 65 you see a real change, which is just before their death. So I think they resonate because the rules keep changing on us, and they become a great way for us to flip back around and see what are we doing today that may or may not be what we want to be doing.
I mean, I think that's a great, because I think people hear Ted Shawn's name because they come to Jacobsville, or they see a YouTube video of Kyle Abraham's post-performance discussion in the Ted Shawn Theater. And so I think that you're sort of the through line of the institution helps that name. So then when you take this stuff out, like what, I mean, Patsy, I'm going to put this on you. Like, what about the mess that that these very complexities that all of a sudden you're inviting people into the home of Jacobsville to say these things can be messy and complicated. Could you just say something about some, trepidation? Feel free to use a different word than that.
Yeah, well, I think, that is the privilege of this material. If Ted Shawn and Ruth St. had only been making music visualizations to European music, they would still have had an impact on the formation of modern dance. They would have still been important figures, but I actually feel that they would not be as engaging and complicated and useful in trying to grapple with the history of modern dance as they are because of their extremely complicated history. I mean, they were doing those music visualizations, that like pure abstract dance, which is pretty radical. They were doing what I would call like a performance studies approach to dance, taking labor, taking sports, and putting that on stage. Really radical. I mean, we're still seeing Abby Z and the New Utility do that today, and it seems radical on our stages. And then there's this third piece that they were doing, all of these things. They were also going into other cultures and taking the dance of other cultures and putting that onto their white Western bodies and showing it to a public who had never seen it before. And it's fascinating, right? It's problematic, it's confusing, it can be angering, but understanding this multifaceted, complicated history really allows us to dig in and to have some conversations that still need to be had today, right? Like, we haven't figured this out, right? We're not like, oh, it's done, great,
So
check.
Lionel is bursting first.
Sorry, I think that's a really important thing because we had access to so much more than they had access to. I mean, I think, Ted had to kind of find a few books about cosmic dance of Shiva to supplement his work in Mahabalipuram, right, when they were on tour. We can look up so many things, and I think with that access comes a certain level of responsibility, right? To say, okay, why is this of attraction to me? What does it mean for me to take this on? I'm not saying that no one should take it on, but like when you're doing that, what are you then exercising of your own privilege or your own ability that you can then amplify something that you believe in, as opposed to accidentally amplifying something you don't necessarily believe in. So I think it gives a kind of ripeness of thought to use them, not use them, but to kind of see the parable or the analogy through them.
Paul, you want to run down some of the cultures that Shawn represented?
Sure. But I do want to say, I don't think Shawn took dances from anyone. He paid for them. And when, for example, when 1925, 1926, when
We're fighting words.
We can fight. So the
I don't know Ted. You know
he goes,
Ted. I know Ruth.
he goes, well, Ruth St. When they go to, they're on the Europe, what they call the Oriental tour. Okay, that gives you a clue about how this tour went. But Anna Pavlova toured throughout Eastern Asia, and she was studying with masters there, and she was performing ballet. And the same producer said, we're going to bring Denishawn through a tour. It started off 8 months. It ended up close to 2 years. And they toured in major cities, in rural areas, but one of what Shawn was bent on was studying with local masters. And he studied dances, traditions, saying that his full intent was to go back to the United States, go on the vaudeville circuit and perform versions, adaptations of these dances that he studied. And he worked with local shamans, but also the Imperial Theater School in China. So this was the highest echelon gatekeepers of art who was teaching the dance to Denishawn. And in Shawn's mind, the learning of these dances, the paying for them, if not was outright license, was at least a blessing. That's not to say Shawn didn't realize the politics of representation at play, because while he was in Japan, he said, we're not doing any of our Japanese dances. I mean, he understood that there was a politics around it, so I think he had an explanation for working around it, but he also knew that there were certain levels of sensibility, and for Shawn, he didn't want the Japanese audiences or critics to see him as an imposter or doing it wrong, because that would blow up his whole claims to authenticity. So I think he understood how complicated it was, but I also think he had a rationale for it, which doesn't necessarily legitimate it, but I think this was a sort of, the vaudeville world was profoundly promiscuous, like thievery was its main tenet. So I think whether it was an Indian dance or Shawn was charged with stealing from everyone. So it wasn't just cultural traditions, it was other artists as well. And that's not to deflate that there aren't, that those are symmetrical, but it was part of the professional milieu. I also do want to say something else. To what end? If Shawn was there, and there's a racist dimension to those forms of cultural appropriation, but I think that what gets left out is why Shawn was why he so desired to perform these dances. Why these ethno-realistic dances? And it was for him, it provided a model for him to be a man on stage that was outside dancing as a man and a woman, besides the sort of a dance about heterosexual courtship. It gave him a religious, a cultural, a social way to be on stage that was legitimate, that had some sort of integrity, and that gave him a sort of model or dramaturgy to be on stage. And the same for Ruth. In some of her solo dances.
I think we get to think there's something in what you just said about trying to escape from the heteronormativity of Ruth and Ted together, and that so he gets a kind of a pass in some ways because he founds the Men Dancers and has a gay identity later. But I'm wondering, Lionel, for you, if you think that Ruth does not get the same kind of pass. She's.
I think Ted gets a pass, probably unfairly, because he's a man. It's easier to go for a woman than it is to go for a man. And I think also it's he sets up institutions that we believe in, so we want to uphold him. He did pay in certain circumstances, and you know Ted's history way better than I do, so I won't shed into that. I would contend that he didn't pay enough. And I would say that the place that he came from, the dollar's strong abroad. Travel to India, you can get away with a lot. That's a form of privilege. I did it last summer, right? Like it is, right? The dollar goes a lot farther there. I can get a driver to take me everywhere so that I don't have to deal with things, right? That is massive privilege. And so to say he paid, yes, but not enough. And I mean, and to the flip of that, Ruth, who I do know a lot more about, Ruth rarely paid. Ruth was sued by a man who was one of the backup dancers in her solo Radha that had 5 brown men standing behind her. And it was thrown out of court, right? I mean, so there is inequity that we just have. The fact that there was inequity doesn't mean we can't also salute what was valuable. But historically, because they've been in positions of power, their glory has a lot of verbiage, a lot of time has been spent on the glory, right? A lot of time, and read anything by Walter Terry. That's all it is. Right? And that's not to say that those things are incorrect, but there's another side that also needs to get some time.
So Norton, I want to say that this conversation right here is a kind of performance of what you and Patsy have put on the walls.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could say something about inviting the variety of writers and artists and choreographers to say why you wanted to invite their comments on the exhibition here at the Pillow.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you, I hope everybody will read the introductory panel over here, because it does try to put it all in perspective. And the very first line I'll call your attention to, it says, what do we see when looking back at the beginnings of this country's dance traditions? So I think that question has a different answer for different people. Yeah. And particularly when this is the stuff that expresses the beginnings of that dance tradition. Again, what do different people see when they see this stuff?
And even just posing that question of the beginnings of this country's dance traditions is already.
And I'll say, sort of jumping off of what was most recently discussed here, that one of the big questions that I get from people as they're trying to put this into perspective, they see this and then they say, well, what were other companies doing at this time? And I have to make the point that there were no other companies. I think what is extraordinary is to imagine when Shawn and St. Denis are basically looking at a blank page and thinking, what would we do if we had an American dance company, and what would we present?
Here's what Denishawn dancer Jane Sherman said about that. The only ballet, she's talking about what's happening in the United States at the time of Denishawn, was at the Metropolitan Opera, and it was so bad you wouldn't believe it. Dancers in musicals kicked 16 to the right, kicked 16 to the left, and then kicked the back of their heads. In vaudeville, you had the soft shoe and the sand shuffle and the buck and wing, and that was all. Except for Denishawn, the Denishawn dancers were the only well-known modern serious performers at that time who were paid.
Yeah. So to me, when I think about, like, okay, you have this blank canvas and you're going to start to do something, that actually looking to the rest of the world was a beautifully inclusive gesture. What they were trying to do is not to say, we're Americans, we do it better, but to say, look at what people in Japan are doing, look at what people in China are doing, look at what people in India are doing, filtered through their eyes. And then this is something that we need to do here in America too, and this is this is how we'll do it. So they are positing a way forward to.
What I'm fascinated with this is a perspective, right? And so you get your squares on the wall, and both of you have also, all three of you have written. So when you got the invitation, Lionel and Paul, to write something in response to the exhibition and to Denishawn, could you say something about like how free and how limited you felt like you could? They're not listening, so.
We gave them total freedom, did we not? You better say yes.
Go ahead.
I didn't write anything polemical. I don't think there's any. I just gave context to the objects, really. I think the thing if given more space, and since I have your attention and it's raining outside, I will, and you're captive, I will say, I think the thing I want to stress, and this is not to mitigate the sort of some of the perniciousness around some of the representation. We understand that. But I think the story for Shawn, and even Ruth St. Denis too, is to say that these dances and these traditions were ways for him to be on stage and for him to there were certain viable models of masculinity that allowed him to be on stage. And for Ruth and Shawn, their lifetime of letters to one another talking about their queerness. Though Ruth did not identify as a lesbian, or she did talk about her queer desire or the possibility that she might be a lesbian, or the way she relates to men is not heterosexual, shall we say. And Shawn, the two of them wrestling in the teens and 20s about trying to understand a way of relating to one another that there was no language for, or books about, or models of. And it was through these dances that they came to understand something about their individual and their sexuality to one another. So part of the story I'm trying to tell about Shawn is to understand why his fascination with these traditions, trying to find models outside of American or Christian. They were both Christian scientists too. They were never actually allowed in the church, but they followed the principles from time to time. And so...
So Lionel, you had a kind of a grimace when Paul said that we recognize the pernicious.
Well, I don't know that we do, always. And I think, yes, in the same way, like for Ruth as a woman at the turn of that last century, rather than the millennium, that was an incredible event. And I can't imagine the fortitude that she had to go through to do that. Their ability to do that also precluded other people's to do that. And I think that's also part of the story.
Precluded who to do what?
Other people to do those dances. I mean, you wouldn't have someone who was Native American or someone who was Indian doing the vaudeville circuit because they weren't allowed to. So it's important to kind of understand within that context. Yes, it gave them options, and that's great, and that's important, and we must state that. And then it also precluded other people from having that option. Or other institutional contexts.
So do you think 21st century viewers in this exhibition recognize that complexity?
I don't know. I come in with so much, I hope so, but I don't know. But just to answer your question, other than the very strict word limit, which is very, very strong, I think what was, we were very free, I felt, to talk about whatever element that we wanted to be talking about. I think I personally was trying to figure out, okay, what are other people talking about so I don't repeat, because I want to make the most of these words. Like, it was like 140 or 50. It felt very Twitter-esque, and I was like, okay, here we go. That was also kind of trying to feel around for what the whole exhibit was, and because I live in Los Angeles, I unfortunately wasn't able to make it to the Williams exhibit, so I felt I was coming from an archive that predated the exhibit, but not the exhibit. So that was my trick, but I felt that part of what I feel was being solicited from this side of the panel was saying, okay, what are things that perhaps people might not think about?
I mean, I think this feels like the way it feels like a 21st century thing. I mean, Ted is an author of his own life. Ruth was an author of her own life, and in very strategic ways and beautiful ways. But they did have the kind of the truth of the story they were telling. And by inviting other people, it seems like you're inviting that to realize, like, okay, maybe there's not that one single thing. Patsy, could you say something about the comment cards?
Well, I think that idea of understanding the complexity was definitely at the heart of the hope of bringing in these other voices, which was something new that we added for this another look. That's another way that this is another look is because we are bringing in these voices, which to some extent, was easier for us because we're Jacob's Pillow and we had these relationships with the artists, with scholars and things. So it built on ability that we had, and it built on the exhibit, seeing what it was like to have the materials there, what materials were speaking to people, and what else we wanted to contribute to that. And that complexity, the conversation, the multifacetedness was a real goal for this, that it wouldn't just be Norton and my voices. And they're in there, but there are other voices too. And for one of the first times, we also wanted to have a place where your voices could be in it, right? The idea that hopefully these tiny 150 word, Twitter posts practically on the wall would spark the conversation, would start that conversation, right? Seeing the different voices would help the viewers feel that they could add their own voice, and whether that's in conversation that's happening in the room, which I see all the time. My post is standing in that reading room, and I hear people reading those perspectives saying, oh, did you see what did you see? And then and they're engaging in a conversation, which is great. And then putting a place where the public could write their own statement and have that part of what's posted as well. And, the idea of a comment box, like, yeah, it's been done, but we really felt that we wanted it to be something where we were displaying your response as well, knowing that we wouldn't have all the answers, and hoping that there would be different things that would be brought in. And we, as we get new responses, we change what's up here too, so that to try to sort of track in a way the conversation that's happening, with the hope that this is a step. You know, we're not like, oh, check, done, we got it, it's finished. But I think that we are moving towards a place where this type of conversation will be more and more what we're doing. And I think that's more and more, you know, the role of what the archives will become, right? It's not just about like, oh, they got some stuff in some boxes, that's great, but I'm going to go do what's happening now. That we are trying to inject the archive into contemporary conversation, and conversation is.
And I think the idea of a living archive that speaks and that you speak with is really important, because it's not that, oh, this happened, it's sealed, it's done, it's correct. Right? It happened, and what were the things that fed it, and what are the things that are feeding now, and how can we talk back with the archive, and how can the archive talk to us?
Yeah, Norton, could you say something, like, just so people get a sense of the scale of like what gets added every summer to the archive?
Yeah, so we are documenting everything that goes on now. We're recording this conversation that we're having. Hello out there in the future. What's wonderful is that the collection that we have, while yes, it includes all these things from 100 years ago, it also includes Inside Out from last Saturday. So, you know, those are literally the bookends of what comprise the archives. And that means that people can really think about this in a whole different way. They're realizing that it's not just what happened 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or 10 years ago. It's what happened this season, earlier, when I couldn't get here. And that is the way that people use the collection a lot of times, and we encourage that and really promote that, because we think that it leads people to think about, oh, what is saved? You know, what is history? And is what I'm doing right now history? I guess
Okay,
it is.
I'm gonna take the last question. I'm not even opening up for yours, because I'm mindful of the time and that people will potentially want to step out to get a ticket to see the Inside Out performance, but they're going to be hanging around to take your questions casually. So my final question is, favorite thing in the exhibition and why? Paul, you look ready.
I would have to say the set piece that's above you behind, to Shiva, which was actually something he had constructed while he was in India working with artisans. He kept a very detailed diary while he was on the tour throughout Asia, and he talks about all of the aspects that went into building it, the length of time it took, the night it premiered, his work with it. So I think after reading so much about how that came into being, and the sort of how through telling the story of that to come into creation, to see it here, there, is pretty astounding.
Who's next?
Are we going down the line?
Sure. The trunks. I mean, I know you said one thing, but there are multiple iterations. For me, they're partially in the piece I made, we had a bunch of trunks, and which are heavy. But they are so symbolic to me of how you try and pack all this stuff in, and then how you try and unpack it, and then how you sheathe it to protect it. It just feels so much, that just feels very resonant to me of all the things. It just, there they are.
That's great. So the metaphor and the pragmatic element of that. Norton, you're up.
So the woman's dress that is back in with the Feather of the Dawn, so this was a costume that was worn by Louise Brooks. So she was a Denishawn dancer and then became a silent film star. And there are so many layers there. I mean, there's layers of meaning, but also just layers in the fact that the costume itself was made from Hopi textiles, but then reconfigured into a dance costume with hooks and bars and different things. It's also, I think, a demonstration of the fantastic work that Caroline Hamilton did in processing and cataloging our costumes so that they could be shown here. And it was also something that was an incredible thrill to bring into the present day because the day that we previewed this exhibit at the beginning of the summer, we showed The Chaperone, which is a forthcoming, or actually it's already been out as a theatrical film, but it'll be on television this fall, about the real Louise Brooks, but a fictionalized account of her. And so it just sort of embodies all the different layers and all the ways in which even something like that is very old, has contemporary relevance for us.
Patsy?
So for me, it's actually something that's not sort of yet part of the collection, but will become part of the archive. And it's this response card that's on the right here that says, we loved it. Because the first time that I dug into that response box and saw a card that was so clearly from a very, very young person seeing the exhibit, made me think about this in an entirely different way. This came from Williams College Museum of Art, right? And most of our patrons are, of an age where they're going to sit in a 2-hour-long performance in a theater, right? And so I saw for the first time sort of how this must be seen from the perspective of a very young person, a person who is not someone that I think of necessarily as our archives user. And I was like, right, yes, this is everyone's history, right? Like this is something that we are all grappling with. And then I was like, so happy because that's a voice that isn't in our archives too much, the perspective of what young people think about the history of modern dance, right? How many places can you find that story? And so I was so excited to see it, to display it, and then to realize that these are all going to become part of the archives, we'll be putting them in our collection, and that we will now be capturing this perspective of what modern dance is, what this history means to a young child. I was like, amazing. So.
Patsy gets the final word. Thank you all for your great work.